Hello. So in this video, we're going to be talking about Ned Kelly's Jerilderie Letter. This is a strange and fascinating document from Australian history. Ned Kelly, who lived from 1855 to 1880, was probably the most famous of the Bushrangers. This was roughly a sort of equivalent to the American frontier Wild West outlaw combined with the English highwayman tradition. The Bushrangers were outlaws in Australia, typically either convicts or children of convicts, which is what Ned Kelly was. His parents were Irish, and they had been transported to Australia as part of their penal sentence. And the Bushrangers, there was a kind of sort of Robin Hood, Jesse James type view of them, which was, of course, quite a romanticized view. They were, as Jesse James was, and Robin Hood, if he existed, which he probably didn't as such, but, I mean, he was a criminal. He was a violent criminal who killed, he stole. The Bushrangers did as well. That was their whole thing. They fought back against the British imperial establishment in Australia, the Anglo-focused government that, because many of the Bushrangers were Irish or sometimes Scottish, they fought back against that sort of anti-Celtic prejudice. And they were seen to greater or lesser extents as champions of the poor. So we have this sort of romanticized notion. And the Jerilderie Letter is a really interesting document because it's probably one of the documents that tells us the most about how the Bushrangers saw themselves. Specifically, how Ned Kelly saw himself and his gang. It's a manifesto, essentially, but it's also a warning. And that's actually kind of interesting because one of the things that Ned Kelly is trying to do with the Jerilderie Letter is basically say, hey, I know there is a reward for my capture. Civilians, do not shoot at me because I will kill you. I don't want to, but if you come after me on behalf of the crown, I will fight you and I will kill you. But the letter was not released until the 1930s. Like, the letter was suppressed. So it's an interesting thing. Like, that element that the government was perfectly happy to, the Australian government, the British government was perfectly happy to let Ned Kelly continue having to fight civilians. But it's an interesting letter. Again, and it sort of centrally explores the mindset of the Bushrangers. It's also an interesting letter because this was dictated to one of Kelly's gang members, Joe Byrne, who wrote it down. And it's basically a sort of weird stream of consciousness document where Kelly seems to just be sort of saying things, and there's no sort of order, or there's a sort of logic to it, but everything is sort of jumbled together. All of the pieces that individually make sense are sort of presented in this strange hodgepodge of a letter. So I want to start with the beginning portion, or at least the beginning portion reprinted here in the literature of Australia. He says here, I have been wronged, and my mother and 4 or 5 men lagged innocent, and is my brothers and sisters and my mother not to be pitied, also who has no alternative only to put up with the brutal and cowardly conduct of a parcel of big, ugly, fat-necked, wombat-headed, big-bellied, magpie-legged, narrow-hipped, splaw-footed sons of Irish bailiffs, or English landlords, which is better known as officers of justice or Victoria police, who some calls honest gentlemen, but I would like to know what business an honest man would have in the police, as it is an old saying, it takes a rogue to catch a rogue, and a man who knows nothing about roguery would never enter the force and take an oath to arrest brother, sister, father, or mother if required, and to have a case and conviction if possible. Any man knows it is possible to swear a lie, and if a policeman looses a conviction for the sake of swearing a lie, he has broke his oath, therefore he is a perjurer either ways. That's the first piece of punctuation we get to. So it's interesting. Like, it's very, very difficult to actually read this because the grammar and mechanics are so irregular. And it's not, I don't have a good sense of this. Like, I suspect Kelly was probably illiterate, which is probably why he dictated this to Byrne. Kelly grew up quite poor in the latter portion of the 19th century, when literacy rates were not very high. He was consistently in trouble with the law. His parents had been, again, Irish transports sent to Australia. His mother was arrested fairly early in his life. So it's unlikely, in my view, that Kelly, and again, without knowing more specific details about him, I don't know a massive amount about him, but I think he's generally a cool guy. But I think he was probably illiterate. Byrne was probably semi-literate because he clearly could write well enough to take this dictation, but this is a reprinted version that seems to have tried to maintain the syntax, the grammar errors, and if a policeman loses a conviction rather than loses, the lack of punctuation, the irregular capitalization, the phrase, I would like to know what business an honest man would have in the police, as it is an old saying, it takes a rogue to catch a rogue. In that sentence, police is capitalized and it, for it takes, is capitalized. Grammatically, they shouldn't be. But then there's things that seem like the beginnings of sentences that aren't capitalized. So the spelling, the grammar, the mechanics, the style is very irregular. Everything jumbles together. And I think if it were punctuated, it would make a lot more sense. But that's the first sort of bit. The whole first portion of this is basically all cops are bastards. And in the film Ned Kelly, starring Heath Ledger and Orlando Bloom as Kelly and Byrne respectively, they do this bit, this brutal and cowardly conduct of a parcel of big, ugly, fat-necked, wombat-headed, big-bellied, magpie-legged, narrow-hipped, splaw-footed sons of Irish bailiffs or English landlords. They do that bit, and the way that they do it is quite funny, and I'm sure not historically accurate at all, because the Kelly gang is holding up a bank in Jerilderie, which is the name of the town where they were when this letter was written, hence the name. He's sort of composing this letter mid-robbery, and the people in this bank who are being held hostage are throwing out phrases. You get this little old woman or whatever it is who's wombat-headed, and they just put that in the letter. I'm sure that's not how it happened. It's fun to think about it, though. It's also a much more coherent letter in the film than it necessarily is in reality. But, so that's a big component of this, is this all cops are bastards notion. And Kelly, of course, his mother was arrested and imprisoned in his youth, and that was one of the things that pushed him toward a life of crime. But this anti-police, anti-authority perspective is also tied into Irish nationalism. Kelly was, again, a second generation Irish immigrant. He was born in Victoria in Australia, but his parents were not. And so it's tied into this notion that the Irish who joined the police in Victoria, or in Australia more generally, have betrayed their fellow country people, their compatriots, by joining the forces of English oppression of the Irish. And this is really interesting because I think this is the same. This was definitely the case in the United States, and I think this was the same in Australia as well. For the Irish, prior to the 20th century, in European race science, the Irish were not traditionally considered to be a white race. They were considered to be something else, which is part of the origin of the term Black Irish, which is probably quite an offensive term. But it's this idea that Irish are a subhuman race or something like this. And I'm an Irish American myself. On my mother's side, we have Irish ancestry. And so fuck that nonsense. But this sort of idea was still had quite a bit of currency in the 19th century. So the period in which Kelly was alive had a substantial amount of anti-Irish racism. And one of the reasons, and I think there's a book, I believe is titled How the Irish Became White or something like that. And it talks about this idea that by joining organizations like the police, which had a very sort of social respectability component to it, Irish immigrants in the US, and I think in places like Australia and probably New Zealand and elsewhere, by joining groups like the police, the Irish could gain a degree of social respectability that they otherwise did not have access to. Which, of course, the flip side of that is that it differentiated the Irish and sort of elevated the Irish above people like African Americans, Aboriginal Australians, Native American, First Nations, Inuit and Métis in North America, etc., etc. But that's a separate issue. So Kelly is very much an Irish nationalist. And again, his anti-police, anti-authoritarian stance is tied into that. So he says here, what would people say if they saw a strapping big lump of an Irishman shepherding sheep for 15 bob a week, or trailing turkeys in Tullarook ranges for a smile from Julia, or even begging his tucker? They would say he ought to be ashamed of himself and tar and feather him. But he would be a king to a policeman who for a lazy loafing coward billet left the ash corner deserted, the shamrock, the emblem of true wit and beauty, to serve under a flag and nation that has destroyed, massacred, and murdered his forefathers by the greatest of torture, as rolling them down hill in spiked barrels, pulling their toe and fingernails, and on the wheel, and every torture imaginable more was transported to Van Diemen's land, to pine their young lives away in starvation and misery among tyrants worse than the promised hell itself, all of the true blood, bone, and beauty. So again, what he's saying here, this is very much this all cops are bastards ideology. This idea that the Irish who joined the Victoria Police and serve to repress other Irish people in the name of the English crown are worse. They are lesser than an Irishman who is working for poverty wages or begging, whatever it is. This sort of the bottom of the social barrel is still a king compared to these cops. And the other element of the Jerilderie Letter that's tied into this is this notion almost of class warfare. This sense of righteous opposition to the wealthy, the powerful, to those in Australian society who could wield money and social privilege and political power against those like Kelly who were impoverished, who did not have access to those resources and social power. And he calls these people out very directly. Again, there is this sort of Robin Hood type element to this. Maybe even a little more contemporary. There's a sort of Luigi Mangione element to this. So he says here, toward the end of the letter, send the high-paid and men that receive big salaries for years in a gang by themselves after me, as it makes no difference to them, but it will give them a chance of showing whether they are worth more pay than a common trooper or not. And I think the public will soon find they are only in the road of good. They are only in the road of good men and obtaining money under false pretenses. So what he's saying here, basically, this is the sort of anti-war sentiment. Let the sons of the rich go and fight, and the sons of the poor stay home. Right? This sort of notion of the rich want me caught. They should come get me. Then we'll see how much they're worth. Right? He basically calls out the wealthy and the powerful for being cowards, for failing to back up their claims or their desire to rid the world of the Bushrangers. And he sort of further calls them out for spending a lot of money to try and sort of have him captured while the poor suffer, while the poor sort of go unsupported, which is the entire basis for why he has had to do what he has had to do. Anyway, he says, I wish those men who joined the Stock Protection Society to withdraw their money and give it, that would be the Stock Protection Society. My sense is that this was like a sort of insurance scheme or like a private security type scheme to basically sort of prevent or compensate wealthy people who had their cattle stolen or their livestock stolen. I wish those men who joined the Stock Protection Society to withdraw their money and give it as much more to the widows and orphans and poor of Greta District, where I spent and will again spend many a happy day fearless, free, and bold, as it only aids the police to procure false witnesses and go wax with men to steal horses and lag innocent men. It would suit them far better to subscribe a sum and give it to the poor of their district, and there is no fear of anyone stealing their property, for no man could steal their horses without the knowledge of the poor. If any man was mean enough to steal their property, the poor would rise out to a man and find them if they were on the face of the earth. It will always pay a rich man to be liberal with the poor, and make as little enemies as he can, as he shall find if the poor is on his side, he shall lose nothing by it. So again, this sort of notion, like, the reason that there is class warfare is because the rich exploit and oppress the poor. If that ceased, if we had social and economic justice, theft would cease. Both because the poor, who would no longer, I guess, be poor, theoretically, but the poor would have no incentive to steal from the rich because the rich support the poor, and it is only through them being rich, less rich, that they would have that security from theft, because nobody would steal from them because they're a good person now. They're doing things to help the community, and so it is beneficial to the community not to steal from them and to not let others steal from them as well. Whether or not that's a practical solution to stopping crime, I don't know, but it does actually make logical sense. In societies where economic equality is in societies with higher degrees of economic equality, things like crime rates are lower. In societies with high degrees of economic inequality, crime rates typically are higher. So then the last thing that Kelly does in the Jerilderie Letter, I'll talk about this very, very quickly, is again, he gives this warning to people not to cross him, to let him fight the police without having to kill civilians whom he says he doesn't want to kill. So he says here, I give fair warning to all those who has reason to fear me to sell out and give 10 pounds out of every 100 toward the widow and orphan fund, and do not attempt to reside in Victoria, but as short a time as possible after reading this notice, neglect this and abide by the consequences, which shall be worse than the rust in the wheat in Victoria, or the dearth of a dry season to the grasshoppers in New South Wales. I do not wish to give the order full force without giving timely warning, but I am a widow's son outlawed, and my orders must be obeyed. And again, this was written actually in 1879, and it wasn't publicly available until 1930. It's an interesting rhetorical choice on the part of the authorities that Kelly is saying, do not cross me. I do not want to have to kill you, but I will. You will do better to avoid me. And the authorities didn't feel like that was something the Australian public deserved to know.